Welcome to Rodney Veal's Inspired By, a production of Public Media Connect, the regional partnership of CET in Cincinnati and Think TV in Dayton. Rodney Veal, our host for this podcast, is an independent choreographer, interdisciplinary artist, and all-around fan of all things arts and creativity, and he's excited to share another great conversation with you. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoy the show, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, Ron, we are on the podcast with you today. Ron Rollins, for folks who don't know, is the true man about town.
Oh,
That's
Rodney.
my title for you.
Stop.
In every way, shape, and form. I mean, Ron, in your work as an editor with the Dayton Daily News, but also as an artist in your own right. So I want the world to get to know you a little bit better. We're going to have that kind of a conversation. How about it?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased and honored to be here. I haven't been on a podcast in a while, and I think the last one was on Libby Balangy's late lamented Gem City podcast a couple of years ago after I retired, and it has been a while.
It's been a minute, but
it has.
That's why I think that's the reason why we wanted to talk to you today. So
absolutely,
hey, come on, we got to hear Ron's voice. And so, Ron, for those who don't know you, kind of encapsulate your early life, because you're an interesting person in the sense of having this really full, robust career in newspaper in the newspaper world, and then becoming an artist. I mean, so we're going to talk about both of those, but let's start with newspapers and editing and how you got into that world.
Well, sure. The major part of my career was with Cox and the Dayton Daily News here in town. Got here in 1986. I was on the Metro desk, basically doing night side editing of, police stories and, weather stories and crime and courts and general features. I was a pretty quick rewrite kid, and I was a kid back then. Ended up deciding that my wife and I got here thinking that Dayton would be kind of a layover town before we would go to a bigger paper. It was the third paper I'd worked at since college, and we ended up just kind of falling in love with Dayton, falling in love with the Dayton Daily News and all the quirky characters there, and making good friends here in town. Eventually, my wife got a job at the paper as the real estate editor, the automotive editor, and then later on as a reporter at the Skywriter out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which the Daily News published on a contract for a long time. And we started having kids and just realized that Dayton's a great place the old cliche, great place to raise a family, because it is. We live in Kettering and liked the schools there for our kids, and had a really fun run at the Daily News. Ended up staying there instead of going to the bigger paper. I interviewed at a couple of those when I was in my early 30s and decided, what they got here isn't better than what I got in Dayton. Ended up having a pretty fun run. I ended up becoming one of the specialty editors, covering arts and entertainment. I was the features editor, had a long-running column in the Sunday entertainment section back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was a lot of fun, where I pretty much got to write about anything I wanted in the realm of arts and entertainment, whether it was local or national. Did a lot back in those days. We had a pretty big arts coverage staff that did a lot of reviewing of local concerts. I think that's probably when I met you.
Yeah, that's about the time. Back in that time.
Did a lot of reviewing of music and stuff like that, which was something that was new to me, but I had a lot of help from my staff teaching me how to do it. Ended up covering the Dayton Art Institute for a while as the entertainment editor, because nobody on my staff felt like they wanted to cover the museum. They were off covering different stuff like dance theater, music and stuff. And so I was like, well, I'll cover the Dayton Art Institute. And I got to know that institution really well. I covered it back when Alex Nargis was the director years ago, when they were doing those big shows from China and Egypt and stuff. That was a lot of fun. Ended up moving up in the management ranks and spent a couple of years as one of the managing editors, running the larger newsroom operation, and ended up becoming the editor of our papers down in Butler and Warren counties, down in Hamilton, Middletown, and a bunch of weeklies down there, and for a couple of years. Then ended up back in Dayton for the last part of my career as the opinion page editor, the ideas and voices section. So, I mean, I've always kind of been a community guy. I guess my reputation at the paper was one of, kind of deep community involvement in addition to the journalism, because I was actually fortunate to end up at a paper where it was encouraged for executive level editors to participate in the community. For example, in nonprofit boards and stuff, as long as you properly recused yourself if one of them ended up being involved in some sort of news coverage, which I was on the board of Dayton History and the Montgomery County Historical Society in Caroline Park for many years, helped found Film Dayton. I was on the board at the Antioch Writers Workshop for a long time. Gosh, I was one of the Dayton creatives in that initiative back in the early 2000s. On the board of House of Bread for a long time, still am, was chair of that board. And then just when your picture runs in the paper a lot in a town Dayton's size, people think you're a celebrity of some sort because it's a small enough town that there aren't a lot of actual celebrities. So,
And I know nothing about that at
right.
all.
I was going to say, so Rodney, people like
Yeah,
you and me,
no clue.
people like you and me, who in a town say the size of Chicago or Cleveland would not be celebrities, are in Dayton, and so you end up becoming invited to, like, MC fundraising galas and do a lot of public speaking and stuff. So,
Right.
the fun part about having that sort of community role in addition to being a journalist meant that I I heard a lot of I heard a lot of stuff. I mean, I heard a lot of stuff out in the community that made good stories and made good journalism, and I was able to sort of, I think, hear things that we might not have heard and pass them along to the right editor and reporter for a long time. And also too, I ended up becoming enmeshed in enough, especially in the nonprofit and arts world, in enough parts of the community where, if some young reporter needed somebody's phone number, I always had it, right? I mean,
Right. Okay.
I became a very good walking Rolodex for the newsroom. The last part of my career, the Daily News, was deeply embedded with WHIO Radio and TV, which were also owned by Cox Enterprises, our parent company. And for the last 12 years of my career, people may remember that WHIO, Radio, TV, and the Daily News and Dayton.com were all together in one giant newsroom
Right.
with a very big media footprint. And so the fun part of that for me was for a lot of us, was getting to learn how radio and TV worked. Instead of watching it from afar and from a newspaper perspective,
Mhm.
we worked together on a lot of stuff. So for the last 10 years of my career, I was also had a radio show on WHIO AM FM that aired on Sunday mornings called Miami Valley Voices, which was a half hour radio show that was pretty much just about whatever I wanted it to be. It was a lot of arts creators, leaders of local nonprofits, and it was just a half hour chat like this, with very light editing about stuff going on in the community that sort of ended up being kind of like a whole extra aspect to the tail end of my time at the Daily News that was a lot of fun. And I would run into people who would recognize, like at the grocery store or something, or at a party, who would recognize my voice and, like, "Are you that guy on WYSO?" I'm like, "No, I'm a WHIO." "Oh, okay." And they didn't really know me from the newspaper. They knew me from the radio, which was kind
Right.
of interesting. And also too, the people that I met and talked to were just endlessly fun and fascinating. So that's kind of the career in a nutshell. Before we lived in Dayton, my wife and I met at Miami of Ohio. I'm from Oberlin. She's from Newark, or Nurk as they pronounce it.
Nurk.
Longest
Okay.
Nurk, Ohio as they
Nurk.
pronounce it. Nurk, Ohio. What's one word? There's T-shirts there that say NERKHAIA, Nurk, Ohio. And we met at Miami at the student newspaper there, and then we worked in Lorain, which was my hometown paper, the Lorain Journal, for a couple of years. Then went down to, I was a government reporter, and then we went down, had an opportunity for me to get into editing and management at a paper about the same size as the Journal down in Wichita Falls, Texas. And so we had fun in Texas, but it ended up coming back here when we realized we were going to have a family, and all of our parents and relatives were still back in Ohio, so we came home. And so that's the career in a nutshell. The job in Texas was a lot of fun because it was a night time work, 3 to midnight, pretty much in charge of the whole paper. Yeah, I worked nights for probably about 10 years, I think, between there and at the Dayton
Wow.
Daily News. Yeah, working nights is a different perspective on the world. You're doing stuff during the day, like taking your kids to school, running errands, sleeping in a little bit late, maybe, or
All right.
sleeping when you can. I worked 1 to 10 in Dayton for many years, and sometimes 3 to midnight. We worked 3 to midnight for 2.5 years in Texas. And, I mean, if you're back in those days, pre-internet, pre-digital newsletter, the paper was the thing. And if anything happened before midnight, it got into the paper. The city council meetings, shootings, tornadoes. I mean, bad weather.
What
I mean,
the
whatever.
actual events, yeah. What
Yeah, the
happened?
actual
You'd cover it.
late sports. I mean, you were getting it into the paper right up until midnight. It was an exciting time and a fun job and fun jobs. I was always enjoyed my jobs. And newspaper people are just kind of weirdos anyway, and they're fun to be around. I mean,
I don't think you're a weirdo. I think you're just well informed. Let's just put it that
well,
way. You're not a weirdo. You're well
the weird thing about journalism is that you're well informed and you're not well informed, and the sooner you realize that, the better off you are. And by that I mean you're well informed in the sense that you know how things work at a certain level, and you do hear things before the public in a lot of ways. But also, too, nobody wants you around, right? I mean, if you're walking through City Hall as a government reporter, they really don't want you there unless they are having a press conference where they want you there, right? I mean, they
right.
don't. Nobody is overjoyed to see you walk into some city commissioner's office and start asking questions. The cops don't want you around at a crime scene. I mean, you're there anyway, but they're not happy about it. And so you're kind of in, but you're kind of out too. It's like you spend a lot of time looking through a keyhole and somebody's putting their hand over it, and you're like, I know there's something going on in there. What is that? And it's like nothing here, nothing for you to see. And then you have to kind of write a story about what you think is going on the other side of the keyhole on deadline, right? So it's things, but you don't, and you're always trying to find out more. That's part of the magic of being a reporter and being a journalist. Yeah, you're in the know, but people don't want you to know things too.
Right. Which
Depending on
is
the kind of coverage you're doing, right?
and which is really interesting from this perspective because you covered art and culture so much, and that's why I
Right.
called you the man about town. Is
Yeah.
the fact that you kind of people told you things. I think the arts
Right.
are much
Right.
more about like, let me tell you about myself versus
Right.
that. And so, I mean, I'm very curious about like because you have seen the Dayton art scene and the cultural scene for so long. How has that changed? I mean, because you have
Oh,
that reporter's sense of seeing, like you said, you're seeing through the eye
right.
hole. I'm
Right.
looking in. There's something going on. How's it? What's your take on how the art and cultural scene has changed since you started peeking in, so to speak?
Right. A lot of things have changed. And I'm going to say mostly for the better, but they also have, there's been a steadiness that I think is interesting. I would say, for example, when I got here, you still had Jilly's Jazz Club, Jerry Gelati bringing in top jazz and blues and some rock stuff, but mostly jazz and blues. And that's gone. Um, and you had Canal Street Tavern, Mick Montgomery bringing in cool, small indie rock stuff. Well, and they're gone. Those guys have passed on, and the clubs have closed, and that's very sad. And I spent many hours in those places, and I learned a lot. However, now you have a new generation of young people. I mentioned Libby Ballingy at the beginning of the show. The people may know her as kind of like this local music promoter with Venus Child Productions, and she's working at the Bright Side with
Inside.
Hamilton and Carly Dixon, downtown, and they're turning the Bright Side kind of into a new, larger combo type venue that sort of combines the best parts of Canal Street and Jilly's. It's a bigger room, you
Yeah,
know.
much bigger room. But but still,
Nobody ever had a wedding at Canal Street Tavern, right? You can do
right.
it's right. It's a successful event space where you could do something big like a burlesque show or a hip hop show that's going to be larger, but you can also scale it down and do something small. And Libby, I mentioned as a just one of several smart music promoters in town. Yellow Cab is another one. Yellow Cab, Brian Johnson, and those guys are bringing in interesting local and national acts, selling out. Oftentimes. So you have this new generation that has, after a couple of years of maybe a fallow period, I would say, after Canal Street and Jilly's went away, which they were going to do eventually anyway, right?
Right. The evolution
People,
of space and
right,
place and
right,
people getting
right.
older and
Sure, people
yeah.
get old, they retire, they close down.
Right.
Eventually, then you have this new generation of people in their 30s and 40s who have picked up the ball and run with it, putting their own flavor and spin on it, and I think providing some real satisfying musical experiences for people. I would say when I got here, the Oregon District was not anywhere close to the vibrant place that it is now. In 86, I'd say I would take the Oregon District of today over the Oregon District of the late 80s in terms of a place to go and see music and
Right.
have a good time and be and feel like you're in a much larger town than Dayton. I would say, the a lot of things come and go. When I was here, City Folk was here.
Right.
City Folk was in its heyday, in its prime, in the late '80s, early '90s. They brought the National Folk Festival in the mid '90s. But I think other things have sort of taken its place. You have the Levitt Pavilion now, right, which is bringing basically throughout the entire warm weather season the kinds of world music, folk music, Americana, hip hop, Cajun blues, whatever the heck you want, for free. 90 evenings a year, or however long their ridiculously long season is.
I'm on the
Right, it's
board.
long.
I'll let
You're on the
you know
board,
this.
I know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and they're
Full
doing
disclosure
everything.
there, people.
Right, and they're doing basically a new cool outdoor free version of what City Folk did in chunks, where they would have like a 4-show jazz season and a 4-show world music season and a 4-show Americana
Right.
blues season, and they would spread it out through so there's when I said there's been continuity, there's been like a torch passing, I think, that has happened in my time in the last 35 or so years here that has been really interesting to see happen because it feels organic to me, and it feels like it didn't happen because outside forces came in and made it happen. It was
Right.
that
Right.
Dayton is this vibrant, cool, small town that has a lot of really cool shit that happens here that is all its own, and we haven't even really talked about the fine arts or the visual arts. I mean, that's another really interesting thing. I mean, the golly, I mean, we've got Neil Gilliman, right? I mean,
Right.
Neil's announced he's going to retire in a couple of years, which is right because he's about the right age for that, and I'm sure he's a little tired. But we have this spectacular orchestra, and we that has the Dayton Philharmonic is they're just they're first rate. I mean, they're a great ensemble. They produce interesting and exciting programming. I've attended for years. One of the best parts of being the arts and entertainment editor in charge of arts coverage in Dayton was getting to know and fall in love with and really learn classical music at well, I was going to say Memorial Hall first because that's where they were playing when I
That's when they were playing.
started. Yeah,
So
right.
you're
And then
the
and then
Schuster
to
for
Schuster.
folks. Yeah. So people don't know that the Schuster is only 20.
It's 20 years old. Yeah.
20 years old.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's this notion that like Memorial Hall, as
Right.
those in the who are listening to the podcast, Dayton, Ohio is this interesting, the 6th largest city in Ohio. I think that's our stat, if I remember
Right.
correctly.
Yeah. I think we are. Yeah.
The 6th largest city is Ohio, but yet we possess all of as you said, this continuity of arts and cultural
Right.
connection, which is
Yeah.
just our through line in our DNA.
Oh, sure. And and like it's, I mean, I'll just toss out, the ballet is good. The DCDC, Dayton Contemporary Dance Company, is beyond a blessing. I mean, it is like if you have any kind of of, of itch or Jones for modern ballet, contemporary dance music, or dance performance, and DCDC does not scratch that itch, you're looking for something that isn't there, that doesn't exist that I'm familiar with.
Doesn't
I mean,
exist.
they,
I love
I mean,
that. That's so
they're,
true.
they're so good. They're so good, and they're so consistent through several generations of leadership since I've been here, with a new one on the way because Renita Hall Saunders has retired, and so there will be new leadership there soon. I'm just really eager to see where they go next because I do my best never to miss a DCDC show.
Which I
They're
encourage everyone to see
oh
when they
they're
go on tour. Go
oh
see
yeah,
them.
they're incredible. I got my ticket for the February show already. And Dayton is, like I said, Dayton is a small enough town that it almost, you would think, doesn't even deserve something like DCDC. It's like you should, when you're at a DCDC performance, it's almost like you want to pinch yourself and go like, is this Houston? Is this Chicago? Is this I mean, what are these guys doing here? And
Right, right.
they've been here for decades. And so, I mean, in terms of, needing things to do, whether it's, you know, pop culture or if you will, higher culture. I'm never at a loss in Dayton. I will say that I've started going to Cincinnati more for stuff for opera, for example, and the Cincinnati Shakespeare Company, because I mean there's Cincinnati is right there. If I want like a big giant arena show, I will go to Columbus. I mean, there are things that Dayton does lack simply because of size and scale, but that's not our fault. And I think the ways that we make up for it with a venue like the Rose, for example, that is getting a lot of stuff that, well, since we're talking about big changes, there was no venue like the Rose, when I moved to town. The Nutter Center would occasionally do big arena shows.
Shows, but not.
I saw Prince there. I saw The Cure there. I saw Red Hot Chili Peppers there. I saw all kinds of really cool shows at the Nutter Center. Once Wright State sort of started to get into their well-publicized financial difficulties, they kind of scaled off on that stuff. And now we have the Rose Center in Huber Heights, which is bringing the kinds of shows for an entire summer season that you used to occasionally get at the Nutter Center. Oh, and by the way, it's a lot easier to get in and out of in the parking lot at the Rose Center too than it ever was at the Nut House. And so
that is true.
That's another case of a torch being passed. One venue sort of was doing cool stuff for a number of years and sort of trailed off, and another venue opens up and does it in a different, just as interesting, just as you could argue even more vibrant way than the old one. And I think there's cases, there's that kind of thing all through the community. So does that answer your question? I mean, I've been
totally.
kind of rambling here. Yeah.
Oh no, but that's why I knew, and just bringing you on and having a conversation would be great. So we're going to take a little bit of a break, folks.
Okay.
But when we come back, we're going to dive into, because he talked about the first half of his life and his thoughts. But now we're going to talk about the second half, because you are a really accomplished artist as well. So
stay tuned. You're too kind.
Stay tuned, folks.
I'm Bonnie Miles, Membership Coordinator of CET. Thank you for listening to Rodney Veal's Inspired By. This podcast is a production of CET and Think TV, two local PBS stations. As PBS stations, the work we do online, on air, and in the community is supported by listeners like you. If you're enjoying the show and would like to support our work, please consider becoming a member at cetconnect.org or thinktv.org. Plus, when you sign up to donate at least $5 a month, you'll get access to special members-only streaming videos on the PBS app through Passport. Learn more at cetconnect.org or thinktv.org. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show.
Okay, so now we're back, and Ron, I want to talk about you. You really, really painted this vivid portrait of the cultural landscape and arts landscape, and your role in it.
I left a lot out too, by the way.
Oh, I know. Which there's a lot more. There's tons of stuff, folks.
Yeah,
I'm just letting you know. But what's really fascinating, you've left, you retired from the newspaper business.
I did. That's
you
in
did
my rearview now. My wife retired. My wife retired now too, and actually, you have to be careful around people who haven't retired. They're like, well, "How's retirement?" And you'll go, "Oh, every day is Saturday," and they'll be like, "Oh, just rub it in." And I'm like, "Well, no, wait a minute. You asked. You asked.
You asked. It's like, what? Every day is Saturday.
I love Saturday."
Well, so congratulations to you and your wife.
Thank you
return as well. So, and I know you guys are traveling and stuff, but I consider you an accomplished artist, and I think.
Oh, thank you.
The fact. So, was that always an idea or a thought, or did it just kind of strike you? How did you dive into being an art maker?
You're very kind.
And become a thing. No, seriously. No.
Well, I should explain a little bit about what I do first, I guess.
Yeah, explain your work.
Yeah.
I told you this is your life. Right?
I do. People can go to rollinsart.org if they want to see me. I do show stuff around town from time to time. I do what I would consider highly gestural, colorful, abstract, very splashy abstract paintings. If you want to think, I am openly, not at all secretively, inspired by and have studied those great abstract expressionists in American painting back in the mid 40s, like post-war.
40s, 50s, post-war.
40s, yes. 50s, 60s, and we're talking Robert
Oh,
Motherwell,
God.
Jackson Pollock,
Pollock.
Willem de Kooning,
Good.
Lee Krasner, who was married to Jackson Pollock, Helen Frankenthaler, Joan Mitchell, who's my favorite, um,
Yes.
kind of considered a second generation abstract expressionist. But I traveled to Baltimore this summer to see a huge show of hers, and I honestly I think one of her very best paintings lives at the Dayton Art Institute. Anyway,
Right. But you could actually go see this
you can
work
go see it.
that
Oh,
Ron's
absolutely.
trying to say. That's the other thing. Go see the
Yeah.
work, people.
Go
Yeah.
see the work. You ask how I got there. I should say I have a studio in Kettering, space that I rent with a friend, Terry Welker, who is also retired now. He's the sculptor who does these big Calderesque kind of mobiles that
Right.
if you want to see his work, go to the main branch of the public library downtown
In
on 3rd
downtown
Street.
Dayton
And
on 3rd Street.
he
You
is
need
the
to go
guy
see
who
it.
created the gigantic acrylic and metal sculptural fractal rain that's hanging in the atrium lobby of the main library over the
It,
staircase there. And Terry is
it it's
anybody who
epic,
build
people.
it's epic, and anybody in town who builds a tall ceilinged atrium or lobby wants to buy a sculpture from Terry, which is cool because he fills them beautifully, and he's a great friend. He's a great friend, and we've had a studio space together just to share costs and ideas and inspiration and company for the last 10 years, I guess, in Kettering. So how did I get into this? My mom was a watercolor painter. She was
I
a
didn't, oh,
member
okay.
of the Ohio Watercolor Society. She painted a little bit abstract, but more realistic. So I was fortunate to always be around a parent who was creative and encouraged creativity in us. In my brother, my sisters really aren't into art making, but my brother was a fine arts major at Ohio Wesleyan, and so he does a lot of design and creative work as well, and photography. He's a very fine photographer. So I mean, I was in a family that encouraged it, and I've always had a bent toward museuming and painting and art history. I mean, growing up in Oberlin, as I did, Oberlin has it's a very small town with Oberlin colleges there, and Oberlin College has the Allen Art Museum, which is this probably the best, certainly one of the best small college art museums in the country, and it
Right,
has
right.
an encyclopedic collection in a beautiful Italian Renaissance style building, and they bring in a lot of contemporary stuff. And Oberlin's a very artsy school anyway. And we moved there when I was in fifth grade in 1970, and I could just get on my bike and ride to this place. And it was free, right? I mean, I could walk in there and I could sit and I could look at the Giacometti, and I could look at the Modigliani and I could study the Monet, and actually they don't have a Giacometti. I should have left him out. And I wish they
That's
did.
okay.
I wish they did.
Wish.
You know,
Wish they did.
uh,
Yeah.
I like I
Every
like
museum should
I
have
like I
Giacometti.
like Giacometti. I don't know why he came to mind, but they do have a Modigliani that's one of the best I've seen. And so I've always had access
That kind of, that, yeah.
to that kind of to art that I could go and really on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon as a kind of a bookish kid that was not into sports, I could spend time in an art museum that and just learn from it and absorb it and soak it in. So I've always had that interest, and to this day, an art museum is still my most happy place. And then so like I said, with my mom's influence, I guess I drew a lot as a kid. I really didn't start painting until I'm going to say about 20 25 years ago. Actually, I inherited my brother's old paints and supplies from college. He wasn't using them. And he said, "Do you want these oils and acrylics?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll play around with them." And my mom encouraged me as well because she was watercoloring then once she was an empty nester. And so I would in my garage, I would just play around. I reminded myself how to draw. I reminded myself, how to do different kinds of things and had a lot of fun. But I also kept it kind of to myself because at the time you got to remember I was in the midst of being the arts and entertainment editor in Dayton,
Right. Which
and
is,
I was kind of had a hand in deciding who got written about and who got covered and which local artists often I would write about, and I made a very conscious decision coupled with a little bit of embarrassment that I didn't think I was as good as anybody I was writing about, right? I wasn't going to be part of the scene that I was covering, in
okay.
essence, right?
You didn't want to become the
So
news, which is, I hear that a lot
yeah,
with
yeah.
reporters. You don't want to be the story. Yeah.
And, right, and honestly, we did have the funny thing. And when I look back on it, we did have a couple of people on staff who really did participate in stuff. We had a couple of staff members who were in local bands fairly prominently. They weren't part of the arts team, right? But we wrote about them.
Right. Yeah.
Khalid Moss, who died
Awesome.
last
Oof.
year, but fabulous
Fabulous.
fabulous nationally known jazz pianist.
Yes.
Was a part-time music writer on my staff for a long time while he was playing at Jilly's, right? I mean, and Steve Sidlow, our managing editor, my boss, you know, had this edict that was very fair and even handed. And he said, like, Khalid is the best guy in town to write about what you need him to write about. If he's willing to do it for what we'll pay him, that's great. We want him, number one. Number two, his art should not suffer because we're paying him to write about music and jazz. So we should have an environment in our newsroom and in our company in which he can do both. He can make art and he can write about music at the same time. So looking back on it, I'm like, I probably could have been a little more
Well,
around
okay.
with my stuff, but
Oh,
at the time,
okay.
I wasn't ready yet. So honestly, I'm going to blame Terry Welker, my dear friend. I mean, he was.
We all blame Terry.
Yeah, we do. Terry's a great guy. He was out. He and his wife Sandy were over for dinner one night, and we were out grilling, and you had to walk through the garage to get to my grill out in the deck. And he's passing my paintings, which are sitting, and he's like, "What the hell are these?" I'm like, I've been dinking around with some paints and stuff." He's like, "Geez, Ron, these are pretty good. I mean, how long have you been doing this?" I'm like, "A couple of years." He's like, "So next thing I know, we're like putting a tarp down on the garage floor and we're spreading these things out." And he's like, "Man, why aren't you showing this stuff? This is not bad." And I'm like, "Well, and he's like, "Okay, I, you can't use the excuse anymore of being the arts editor because that's not your job anymore. You've moved on in your career.
Right.
You
I'm so
don't
glad
have
to
that
get that.
excuse to hide behind anymore." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I started showing it around town. The first place I showed was at the sideshow at Yellow Cab years ago. And the if you don't know the
Mhm.
sideshow, they just brought it back this year after COVID. It's a really great kind of outsider art community music art
Right. Yeah.
festival at the Yellow
I,
Cab
re- I
downtown.
do.
It's a
Yeah, I do
great
remember it.
show.
Yeah.
And it's gotten, I've kind of aged out of it. I think it's a much younger crowd of contributors to it now than it was when I was there, which is cool because I've they're still encouraging people like where I was back then,
To
to
do that,
show
to kind
something
of
for the
step
first
out.
time and
Yeah.
get that kind of
Right.
feedback from an audience that's looking at your stuff and asking questions about it, possibly buying it. And then so from there I just kind of like started to share. So I mean I'm pretty out there now. I mean, once I came out of the closet, I was pretty much, uh,
You are an
pretty
artist.
into the community, yeah. And
Yeah,
and
you
and
are.
the cool thing about Dayton is, well, there's many cool things about Dayton that we've already talked about.
Sure.
What I
Yeah.
found, what I found, I was a little nervous about it. What I found about Dayton's arts community was I was worried that there would be this kind of like, you're not a painter, you're a journalist. It's sort of like people get into this thing where it's like they know you as one thing and they can't imagine you as
That you
something
might
else.
have that you might have interest in other areas,
Right.
but
It's sort of like, what? Johnny Depp plays guitar? That's not right. He's an actor. It's like, okay. But there's, people do have multiple interests,
Mhm.
what I found is that the visual arts community in town was extremely open and welcoming, and sort of pleased to have me be a small part of it, and that was a lot of fun. I was being embraced by people that you really admire and whose work you really love for your own work is wonderful. And maybe it would have happened that way in another town, but I describe it as a Dayton like quality where it's like in Dayton, Ohio, man, if you want to go out and plant your flag and do something, people will let you do it. They'll encourage you to do it. They'll invite you in. They'll give you good feedback. They won't make you feel silly. And I love that about the community, and that's how I felt. So now I'm out there. I like to paint. I don't do it as much as I should or would like to, and I'm pretty, I don't want to say casual about it. When my style is such that I work very fast, I end up thinking about a piece a lot longer than I spend making it. And if you see a piece of mine, you'll understand what I mean when you see it. It's because it's very gestural. I work very quickly, and you can see where my hand has been. There's a
right.
lot of stuff.
And but there's an intentionality by the hand. There's no
There
way
is.
like
Yeah,
with
yeah.
this And sometimes there's a tendency to see abstraction that looks like it's an abstraction because there was no thought. But yours is thought. I can see
Oh,
the
thanks.
gestural, and I can speak to that. I think I speak from the gestural standpoint just because I'm a dancer. I see
Sure,
things in
right.
gesture, and so I think that's what's really cool about your work. And
Well,
but you
thanks.
talk but you talk about something like that's really you're hitting upon something with Dayton, Ohio. It is truly one of the most unusual places in the sense of
Yeah,
you
it
can
is.
do just about anything, and no one will say, I'm not sure about you," or "I'm not sure about that thing." So
Right. Well,
and
and there's a lot of cross pollination too, and I think you and I are both kind of in that similar boat where, I mean, I think, the stuff that you get asked to do because you're already known for doing something else. I mean, yeah, Rodney's a dancer, but you're also on a lot of boards. You teach,
yes,
I mean, you do all these, you
I
wear
know
many, many, many,
many
you do the
hats.
art show, you do this kind of stuff. I mean, you wear many, many, many hats. And I think Dayton is a cool place because it does welcome and encourage that. Like it's, well, you wear that hat well, so you probably might wear this hat well too. Would you also try this
True,
hat?
hat on.
And I
And so
and I
you end up
and I
with a
think,
stack of hats like me, so it's like,
yeah.
you
What's that?
same
There's that kids book, Hats for Sale. Where
as for
the guy
sale.
had like
Alright,
a stack of 40 hats.
yeah.
And that's one of the things I like about the town. That's one of the things I like about the size of it and the scale of it and the people who live here. And it's not a scary place, and that's in terms of putting yourself out there and being creative, and that's really cool. Like I said, I study. I've studied the abstract expressionists. I haven't done that in any formal way. It's just when I find myself in a museum, it's the stuff that I end up looking at the most and being most captivated by. I don't walk up to a Winslow Homer or a Thomas Eakins painting, even though I like those guys, and go, well, how did he do that? Because I know how he did it.
Yeah,
I know how that got made. I will walk up to a Franz Klein or a Robert Motherwell or a Hans Hofmann or a Joan Mitchell painting, and I'll be like, how did they do that? Like, how did that spatter of color and that layering of paint
paint
and that
transcends
gestural
yeah.
action, how did that happen? I want to do that, and I want to make that. And that's, so when I say I've studied it, that's what I mean. I mean, I'm at the museum leaning in, looking into that kind of work, wondering how that gets made. What I'll do is when I look at a Joan Mitchell painting, I'll try and figure out, and they're usually big paintings, right? I mean, she worked
Those are massive. She did massive
massive,
scale
and she was
abstractions.
fabulous. I will play a little game, parlor game with myself, where I'll try and find the last piece of paint that she put down on the canvas, and and by doing that, I'm making myself look into and underneath her layers, and I try and find what do I think is the last piece of paint that actually was placed on this canvas. Where is it? And I think sometimes I get pretty close, and I'm looking.
Oh, wow.
I'm,
I can
and I'm looking for something that doesn't have another color laid over it or spattered on it, it's almost always in the middle with her. I think she worked from the edges into the
just
center,
it's
and
fascinating,
yeah, I
fascinating.
think, and I don't do that. I mean, I'm usually an in the middle of the canvas kind of guy. I use white
Okay.
space a lot. You mentioned dance. I get asked questions of like, did you ever study dance, Ron? And I'm like, because your paintings have this kind of fluid motion. I'm like, nope, never
Yeah,
have. I like
right.
dance. We've talked about DC a minute ago. I enjoy watching you move. It's like, I mean, I feel like I learned something from watching people like you do what you do.
Well, thank
But
you.
and if
Thanks.
that translates into my painting, that's great. I get asked a lot, did I ever study Chinese or Asian calligraphy? And I'm like, no. I like it. It's beautiful. And when I'm near it, I'm drawn into it, but I can't claim that it's more than a one of many influences on the way my hand moves,
Right, right,
brain works.
right,
But I've never studied it, right?
right,
And
right.
so it's like there's a lot of. I also don't I don't title paintings, because what I've found is that when somebody looks at one of my pieces, it's kind of like looking at clouds. It's like, oh, I see a duck. Oh, I see a horsey. Oh, I see Grover Cleveland. It's like, well, okay, if you
If
see
that's
it
where
in there, it's in there, and I want you to enjoy it on your own level of
In
seeing
terms,
in it what you see. And if I name the painting like Storm Cloud 4, you're gonna be like, well, it doesn't look like a storm cloud to me, and I don't want to ruin it for people. So I want you to find whatever you like in there. And when people, it's fun to watch people looking at the work because they'll be in, and if they're in the studio, I'll let them touch it too. It's like, it's like,
right? Which is,
and the,
that's a cardinal sin of art. I was told.
oh, sure, right, yeah, you're not
And
allowed.
I
Right.
let people touch my work all the time. Like,
Yeah,
run your
yeah,
hands
same
across
here.
the weavings.
Right,
This is
exactly.
woven paper. It's fun.
Yeah, if you're in my studio and you're here drinking bourbon with me, you can touch it, sure. I mean, I don't want you to poke a hole in it, but but if you want to touch because I know that you don't get to do that at the museum, even though you might want to.
Right.
So
might
you can
want
do it
to,
at my
right.
studio. If you want to feel how that paint feels on the canvas and push it a little bit, I mean, that's an experience I want you to have, and I'm glad for you to have it here. The other thing is like selling, as you know, selling stuff is cool. I don't sell. I sell basically enough every year to cover my studio rent. So in other words, this is a glorified hobby for me. So it's not an occupation or anything like that. And I could not make a living doing it, and I wouldn't try, because the words "starving artist" are usually true.
Based on your experience, and you've seen it. That's
I've
the
seen
thing.
it, and
You've seen it. Yes, it's a
yeah,
very real statement. Unfortunately,
but here's the other thing too, though. Back to Dayton being Dayton, there are a number of people in Dayton who are making a living as visual or performing artists or dancers or photographers or novelists who
I totally agree.
they can teach on the side if they want to, and they can have day jobs if they feel like it. But there are a number of people. You walk through Front Street. Oh, speaking of something that was not here in 1986 in the way it is currently, Front
The
Street.
Front
When I
Street
got
Art
Front Street,
Studios.
right?
Yes, do
Yeah,
not. Yes,
the Front Street Art Studio is pretty much in Dayton. If there's anything else like that in Ohio, I'm not familiar with it. Where it's that concentration of galleries and artist studios and stuff. I mean, you walk through that place on a first Friday, and it's like the creativity is like it's like a haze that you just kind of covers you. Sometimes it's a literal haze, but anyway,
well,
no, but
depending upon the crowd you're hanging with at Front Street, which I get.
but you know what I mean. If there was nothing. Front Street, the buildings obviously existed in
Right.
the late '80s, early '90s, but they weren't like they are today, where it was this developed, cleaned up, concentrated home for 100 artists who
To
are many of
practice their
whom are over
craft.
there practicing their craft, and several of whom are over there making a living doing
Living.
it. Yeah,
Very much so. Very much
and
so.
I think Dayton, by being an affordable place to live and being a place that does, I mean, you can't sell a painting for as much in Dayton as you would sell it in even Columbus or Cincinnati because of the
Yeah.
size and scale of the market. But you can make a living here because you can afford to live here on whatever you sell. And I don't think there's a lot of people that would fall into this category that I'm
There's
describing.
a few.
But there's a few. And
Listen,
that's kind of,
there's more than a
that's kind
few
of cool.
considering for
Right.
a
There's more
city
than
of
a
our
few.
size. For a city our size,
I
actually,
agree.
which goes to that old point of like the fact that we have a Philharmonic, an opera, a
Right.
ballet company, a modern dance company, a contemporary art space,
Right.
artist studios, a museum, and the list goes on and on and on of
Right.
major colleges and universities that devote themselves to art
Right.
making with
Right.
programs. It's kind of like for a city of our size, scale,
Yeah.
it's
And
unusual.
it is unusual, and there are things that I wish we had, okay, that we don't have.
Okay, name some things that you wish we would have that we don't have. I'm kind of curious from your perspective.
I
You've
do
seen
wish
that.
I do wish I didn't have to drive to Cincinnati or Columbus to see an arena show on the scale of Bruce Springsteen, right? I mean, on the other, and I mean that would be great. I mean, it's only an hour away, and I get that. And I also know too that if I lived in Chicago or Atlanta, I would be driving just as far and just as long to get to
go see
whatever
them.
arena. So I
Right.
get that, but it would kind of be nice though to have a venue of that size and scale that was bigger than the Rose, that really did bring that level of tour to town. That'd be nice. That's kind of a pipe dream though. What do I wish? Well, rather than what I wish, I can think of some things that I think that if Dayton had them, they would be marked improvements to what's already here that would raise a lot of games. For example, quoting Eva Buttacavoli at the Contemporary on this, she's always felt that the one thing that Dayton doesn't have on the in the visual arts scene that would raise it to a higher level would be an MFA program, either at Wright State or UD. And if you think about something like that, that makes a lot of sense, because her point has always been those are great schools and they have good art departments, especially Wright State's visual arts department is excellent.
Right.
However, and having an MFA program in your town brings a level of teaching, thinking, exposure. It raises the bar in your visual arts community just that much more, and brings that much more to what's already happening. And so I'm like, oh, that's a pretty good observation. I mean, if you had something like that, and I'm not going to, I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but I know what she means when she says that
right.
The arts community is at a level of like one or two things can really be game changers. I would say the Levitt, was an obvious game changer, in terms of downtown vibrancy, downtown life, downtown livability, all of us having an opportunity to do cool free stuff, on a moment's notice,
exactly.
yeah.
And making it accessible to everyone, which was that
right.
It was those combination of those two pieces. And I think a lot of people don't know that about Levitt, is that we went in with that intentionality based upon the national Levitt model and mission, and see what and it's proof that if you do it, it's like almost like the edict, build it and they will come.
Right.
We built it and they came. And
they
so
came. And they keep coming.
So which, to your point about Eva's point about the MFA programs of visual art, you build one, they'll come.
Right.
It's just having a vision for it.
Yeah, I think something else that would be, I think larger cities have more than one art museum. Now this is kind of addressed a little bit by what the Contemporary is doing, the Dayton Visual Arts Center evolving into the Contemporary, I think, if you go to visit Chicago or Cleveland or Columbus, there's actually Columbus isn't in this boat, but there's if you go to Cleveland or Cincinnati, go to Cincinnati. Okay. There's Cincinnati as a city that is considerably larger than us, but it's not like Dallas larger than us. Right. So,
no, it's not that.
So Cincinnati is still, but to some people, a smaller city. Well, it has the Cincinnati Museum of Art. It has the Taft.
Yes.
Around the corner. It has the Contemporary Arts Center. It has, it has a big three, if you will.
There's a big three. Even the Cincinnati, the college, the university has a museum. It has its own arts space. So
there's an arts component to the Union Center Arts Complex or Museum Complex. So it's like, okay, just in that next size up level of city, you have this museum community where it's not just the Dayton Art Institute all by itself, and then the Contemporary, which is cool, but kind of new at what it's doing in that space. It's like it would be really cool if Dayton was just a little more, if there was one more thing like that. And I don't know I don't know if that's going to happen or not. And I'm also not complaining. I'm just saying
I totally posed it as your wish list. So
it's a wish. Yeah, if you were going to come up with a wish list, it'd be cool if DCDC wasn't all by itself. There are some. I would say Wright State presents some excellent contemporary dance, and some of the university communities do. But if DCDC, Dayton Ballet is more of a traditional,
classical,
point toe,
ballet on point,
companies that if DCDC had another company like it to feed off of, and there are some smaller groups. There's the Dayton Dance Collaborative. There are some smaller groups that are kind of moving that way
in that space.
But also too, they're very small and they're very independent, and they're not at the level of accomplishment or funding or presentation or reputation as DCDC. I think DCDC would have fun if they had another company kind of working in their space that they could feed off of and
Yeah.
learn from,
It's
and also
it's
too they could friendly competition.
friendly
It's
competition.
yeah,
It's a nice it's a good riff. And like in jazz bands, you want the best players in the band to riff
right,
off each other to
right,
make the best sound and have
exactly,
the best
exactly.
experience.
It's a partial wish list. I mean, end of the day, I'm happy we stayed here. We had a chance. I interviewed at the Plain Dealer a couple times back in the early '90s when I was in my early 30s, thinking that we would maybe move closer to Oberlin where my parents lived. We're glad we stayed here. I mean, when I
Right.
was at the Dayton Daily News, I got to edit 4 books. 3 books of history. I get to have a radio show. I got to do all this cool stuff. My wife got to work at the same paper. That would have been hard to do, someplace else. Or
Right.
just,
Right.
I mean, where we were both at the same company in the same newsroom. I mean, we had so many. This turned out to be such a great place to stay. I mean, we've never had a regret. And so, I mean, maybe that's a good way to wrap up. I don't know that it's never been. Amy and I have never sat around and gone like, well, gosh, I really wish we'd moved to Kansas City or so. That's never happened. I
Never
mean,
happened. Never in a million
just
years. Right.
really we've been very grateful to have landed here, and we did land here kind of by accident. I mean, we had some family here, but on Amy's
But
side of
not really
but it
not really
wasn't
a true
neither sets of
Daytonian. Yeah.
right, neither sets of parents were here. We didn't know anybody here before we moved. The Daily News was a really good paper, but one of any number of ones that I was applying to at the time, that time in my career. I almost got a job in Jacksonville. I almost got a job in Jackson, Mississippi. I almost got a job in I mean, we almost didn't make it here, and I'm really glad we did because it's just been a good run. Plus, I met you, Rodney.
Which is I thank you, and I've met you. I mean, the thing
Yeah,
is, we both been on this kind of twin journey of
I think
like
so. Yeah,
of seeing and observing Dayton, and I always
yeah.
enjoy talking with you, talking to you,
Oh,
talking about all
thanks.
these big subjects about art and culture in our community.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I said that's what made you the perfect guest for this show. So
Well, thanks.
yeah, well, thank you, Ron. I
You
appreciate it.
betcha.
All right,
Not a problem.
all
Happy
right,
to do it. And if you ever want me to come back, just let me know. I'm sure we can
totally.
talk.
Well,
We can talk about boxing, which I did for a while.
boxing. Oh my God. Okay, we got to talk about
I,
boxing and film. That's our
I
next
wasn't.
two big.
We can talk about boxing and film. I was not good at boxing. I briefly. I spent about 10 years doing the mitts workout at Drake's gym downtown. John Drake is a great guy, and he signed me and a couple of others of us up for a kind of a white collar boxing match at Memorial Hall, where I had my
I
rib broken.
remember.
Where I had my rib broken for me in front of 1,200 of my new best friends. Yeah,
I remember that. I remember that. I do.
yeah, I do
It was
too.
really well. Yeah, you had a lasting memory.
My
There's something
perspective on it was much different from yours, Rodney.
very much. I would not want to break a rib. I would be like the worst patient ever, and I had
Yeah, it
the
wasn't
biggest.
fun.
I'd be like, ah, I would be like, I couldn't handle it. Knock me out. Put me in a
We'll
coma
talk.
until the
We'll
heals.
talk about that next time.
Rodney Veal's Inspired By is a production of Public Media Connect, the regional partnership of CET in Cincinnati and Think TV in Dayton. There's a lot of great art happening around Southwest Ohio, and we're excited to be part of it. If you like this episode, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can learn more and find the show notes at thinktv.org/inspired by or cetconnect.org/inspired by. Thank you.